The morning Marcella Alden walked into the cattle pen alone, every man in Caldwell, Kansas stopped breathing. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kishom Trail still hummed with the dust of driven herds and the boots of men who thought themselves the measure of the earth. The town of Caldwell sat at the edge of Indian territory like a dare written in fence posts and sun-bleached wood, and it was here that Marcella had buried her husband 8 months prior and decided, in the quiet of a grief-hollowed house, that she would not be buried alongside him in spirit. She had a ranch to run, she had cattle to sell, and she had absolutely no patience left for men who believed a woman in mourning was a woman undone. She was 31 years old. Her husband, Robert Alden, had been a good man and a poor rancher, and those two facts had warred with each other for the 7 years of their marriage until a fever settled the argument permanently. He had left her with a small herd, a modest homestead 3 miles outside of town, 2 ranch hands who were loyal but green, and a reputation as the widow who kept things together with nothing but stubbornness, and a ledger book she carried like a Bible. What he had not left her was any kind of standing with the cattle buyers who came down through Caldwell in the spring, men with thick wallets and thicker opinions about who was fit to negotiate. Marcella had arrived at the Sumner County stockyards that Tuesday morning in a brown wool skirt and a cream blouse that had seen better days, her dark hair pinned back with the kind of efficiency that left no room for sentiment. She had her cattle papers folded in the breast pocket of her riding jacket, and she had rehearsed her numbers so many times the night before that they ran through her head like a hymn. The buyer she sought was a man named Gerald Hooper, who operated out of Wichita and had a reputation for fair dealing with the ranchers he respected. He did not, as Marcella discovered, number her among that company. She had found him standing at the outer fence of the main pen, where her 23 head of longhorn were being held. He was a stout man with a red face and the kind of mustache that seemed to compensate for something. He had looked at her papers, then at her, then back at her papers, and then he had said, with a kind of theatrical patience that she recognized as condescension wearing a polite costume, "Mrs. Alden, I think it would be better if you had someone handle this for you. A foreman, perhaps. This is a difficult business." She had told him, very calmly, that she was the owner of the Alden Ranch and that she was quite capable of handling her own affairs. He had then said, with a gesture toward the pen, that the cattle looked thin and skittish, and he was not convinced the stock was worth the asking price, and that perhaps she should reconsider. This was when Marcella had looked at the pen, looked at the gate, and made a decision that even she would later describe as either very brave or very foolish, and she was never entirely certain which. She opened the gate and walked in. 23 longhorn cattle in a confined pen were not a gentle thing. They were hot from the drive down, restless from the holding, and they moved with the particular nervous energy of animals that had been handled enough to distrust human proximity, but not enough to be entirely broken. Several of the hands who had been leaning on the outer fence straightened abruptly. Gerald Hooper made a sound that was half protest and half something more genuine, something closer to alarm. Marcella walked to the nearest steer, a big roan animal with a spread of horn that could have opened a man's chest, and she set her hand flat on his flank and spoke to him in the low, even tone she had learned from her father, who had kept horses in Missouri, and believed that animals understood intention better than they understood words. The steer shuddered once, rolled his eye back at her, and then went still. She stood there in the middle of the pen, with cattle shifting around her, and the morning sun cutting hard and bright across the dust, and she looked back at Gerald Hooper through the slats of the fence and said, loud enough to carry, "They are not thin, Mr. Hooper. They are trail lean, which is a different thing entirely, and a man in your profession should know the distinction." That was when she became aware of him. She noticed him the way you notice something solid when everything else around you is moving. He was standing at the far corner of the pen, on the inside, which meant he had come in through the secondary gate that the stockyard workers used, and he had done it quietly enough that she had not heard him enter. He was tall, with the kind of build that came from work rather than size, broad through the shoulders but not heavy, and he was wearing a plain gray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and a hat that had been through weather. He was perhaps 35, with a jaw that looked like it had been set firmly at birth and never relaxed, and dark eyes that were watching her with an expression she could not immediately read. He had not said a word. He was simply standing there, inside the pen, in a position that placed him between her and the largest cluster of cattle on the south side of the enclosure, and she understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with vanity or sentiment, that he had come in not to interfere but to stand where she could reach him if the animals turned. He was not trying to rescue her. He was not trying to take over. He was simply making himself available, the way a good horse makes itself available to a rider it has decided to trust, and the distinction was so unexpected that for a moment she forgot entirely what she had been saying to Gerald Hooper. She turned back to Hooper and finished her point. She quoted her price. She stood her ground with 23 longhorns and one very quiet stranger for company, and by the time she walked back out of that pen 12 minutes later, Gerald Hooper had agreed to $9 a head, which was $2 more than he had been willing to offer through the fence. The stranger came out behind her, through the secondary gate, and was gone before she had finished folding her papers back into her pocket. She caught a glimpse of him crossing the yard toward the stables, and she noted, with the part of her mind that had recently begun noticing things against her better judgment, that he walked with the unhurried certainty of a man who was entirely comfortable in the space he occupied. She did not learn his name that day. She learned it 3 days later at the feed store on Main Street, when old Clarence Briggs behind the counter said, "You just missed Phineas Wells. He was in here not 10 minutes ago asking after the Alden ranch." Marcella went very still in the way she did when something required her full attention without showing it. "Asking after it how?" she said. Clarence shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a man who knew more than he was offering. Said he heard the place might be looking for a ranch foreman. Said he had experience. I told him you were the one to talk to. She absorbed this information, bought her grain and her salt blocks, and drove her wagon back to the homestead with the particular internal argument that she had been having with herself since the cattle pen, which went something like, she did not need a foreman. She had Tommy Reese and Burl Hatch who were capable enough, and she certainly did not need the complication of a strange man on her property, even a quiet one who had the good sense not to pretend she needed saving. The argument concluded, as it always seemed to when it involved something she genuinely wanted but was afraid to want, with a compromise. She would talk to him. She was not obligated to hire him. He came to the ranch the following morning, arriving on a bay gelding that moved with the easy, long-strided gait of a horse well chosen and well kept. Marcella was at the fence near the barn when he rode up, and she watched him dismount and tie the horse with the same economy of motion she had noticed at the stockyards. He took off his hat when he approached, which most men of her acquaintance did as a formality. On him it looked like something else, like a genuine acknowledgement. "Mrs. Alden," he said. "I'm Phineas Wells. I understand you might have use for an experienced hand." His voice was low and even with a trace of something southern in it, though worn down to almost nothing by years and distance. He had dark eyes, darker than she remembered from the pen, or perhaps she had not been looking closely enough then. "I might," she said, which was as close to conceding interest as she was prepared to go on short acquaintance. "Tell me about your experience," he told her. He had spent 12 years working cattle, starting in Texas as a boy of 16 on his father's ranch, then moving north with drives up the Kishom when the Texas ranges got crowded. He had worked as a trail boss for 2 years, which she took note of, and before coming to Caldwell he had been foreman on the Hutchinson Ranch in Barber County, which she also took note of, because the Hutchinsons were known for running a serious operation. He had left, he said, because the Hutchinsons had sold, and the new owners brought their own people down from Kansas City. "Why Caldwell?" she asked. He looked at her with a directness that was neither aggressive nor evasive. "I saw what I saw at the stockyards," he said, "and I thought this might be a place worth working. It was not a flattering thing exactly, and it was not a clever thing, and perhaps that was why she believed it. She hired him at $30 a month with a room in the bunkhouse and board included. She told him clearly that she ran the ranch, that she made the decisions, and that she expected any man in her employ to understand that distinction without requiring reminders. He said, "Yes, ma'am," in a tone that indicated he had already understood it, and went to put his horse in the barn. Tommy Reese, who was 22, and tended to take the measure of new arrivals with transparent suspicion, watched this exchange from the doorway of the barn, with his thumbs hooked in his pockets. When Phineas Wells walked in and asked where to put his tack, Tommy gave him the look that young men give men they are not sure they can beat in a contest they have not yet defined, and said, "You any good?" "Good enough," Phineas said, and began unsaddling his horse. Tommy told Marcella later that week, with the reluctant honesty of someone who had been hoping for a different verdict, that the new man knew what he was doing. Burl Hatch, who was older and quieter and observed everything from a comfortable distance, said nothing for several weeks and then told Marcella, "He's all right," which from Burl was approximately equivalent to a written recommendation. The work of the ranch consumed April entirely. There were fences to repair after the winter, calves to brand, a section of the creek bottom pasture that had flooded and needed the fence line moved before the next wet stretch. Marcella worked alongside her men as she always had, because she had not been raised to direct from a distance, and she noticed that Phineas Wells worked with a focused, methodical competence that made the other two work better without any of them appearing to realize it was happening. He talked when there was something to say and was quiet when there was not. He had opinions about cattle and expressed them plainly when asked, and did not express them when not asked. He ate supper at the table with Tommy and Burl and said thank you when Marcella set food out, and once, on a Thursday evening when the work had gone long and she had not had time to cook anything substantial, he appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, quietly, "If you don't mind, I can put something together." And when she looked at him in surprise, he added, "My mother cooked for a ranch of 12. I learned young." She stood back and watched him move through her kitchen with a matter-of-fact ease that was somehow both domestic and entirely masculine, and she thought, with some alarm, that she was going to have to be very careful about the direction her thoughts were beginning to travel. She had been a widow for 8 months. She had loved Robert Alden with the practical, deep-rooted affection of a woman who had married sincerely and meant every word of it. She missed him. She still had moments, usually in the early morning before the day asserted itself, when the weight of his absence settled on her chest like a stone. She was not looking for anyone. She had not been looking for anyone. But grief, she was learning, was not a wall. It was more like a field after a hard winter, which looked dead and felt empty but was not, and the spring was coming whether she invited it or not. May arrived with warm winds off the prairie and the smell of grass coming alive, and with it came a complication in the form of one Delbert Crane. Delbert Crane was a land speculator from Wichita with a smooth manner and a persistently renewed interest in the Alden property. He had approached Marcella twice in the winter about purchasing the ranch, both times with offers she had declined, and both times he had received her refusal with the particular patience of a man who expected eventually to succeed. He arrived on the 3rd day of May in a good suit and a hired buggy, and Marcella met him on the porch with the same calm she brought to everything she did not want to deal with. He wanted to buy the ranch. He had increased his offer. He made several observations about the difficulty of a woman running a cattle operation alone, each one phrased with the careful courtesy of a man who wanted to be insulting without being quoted on it. Marcella listened to all of it without interrupting, because she had found that men like Delbert Crane often talked themselves into corners when given enough room. Then she said that the ranch was not for sale, that she had no difficulty running it, and that she hoped he had a pleasant drive back to Wichita. From across the yard, Phineas Wells was mending a length of fence near the water trough. He did not look up from his work during any of this exchange. He did not move toward the porch or make any gesture that might suggest he was monitoring the situation. But after Delbert Crane's buggy had cleared the gate and disappeared down the road, and after Marcella had stood on the porch for a moment with her arms crossed, thinking thoughts she was not quite ready to speak aloud, Phineas set down his tools, walked to the water trough, washed his hands, and said, without raising his voice enough to cross the whole yard, just enough for her to hear, "You handled that well." She looked at him across the distance. "I know," she said. He nodded, picked up his tools again, and went back to the fence. She went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand on the counter, and the feeling she could not name was doing something complicated in her chest, and she thought, with great clarity, that this was going to be a problem. The summer moved through the ranch in the long, golden way of Kansas summers, hot and broad and filled with the kind of work that leaves no room for anything but itself during the days and leaves everything else very loud in the evenings. Marcella kept her distance from her own feelings with the discipline she kept her ledger book, entering things in neat columns and not allowing them to bleed across the margins. She was professional. She was proper. She was a widow in a small town where people noticed things and drew conclusions, and she had neither the time nor the inclination to give them material. Phineas Wells, for his part, was scrupulously correct in every outward particular. He addressed her as Mrs. Alden. He kept to his side of whatever invisible line existed between employer and employee. He never looked at her in a way that could have been called anything other than respectful. And yet there was the evening in June when a thunderstorm came down off the plains without much warning, and the cattle were in the south pasture, and Marcella was already on horseback, and through the gate before either Tommy or Burl had their saddles on, and Phineas came alongside her on the bay gelding without a word, and the two of them turned the herd together in the rain, and the lightning with the kind of wordless coordination that usually took years to build between two people. And when they finally had the cattle in the barn, and they stood in the doorway watching the storm sheet down across the yard, soaked through to the skin, she became aware that he was looking at her profile and not at the rain, and when she turned her head he did not look away. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds, which is a long time when you are counting, and then he looked out at the rain and said, "Good ride." "Yes," she said, and her voice was entirely steady, and she was very proud of it. There was the afternoon in July when she had been arguing with a problem in the account book for 2 hours, and had finally put it down on the table in the kitchen, and pressed her palms flat against the wood and stared at the ceiling, and he had come in for water and seen the open book and said, "May I?" And she had gestured at it without looking, and he had sat down across from her and worked through the numbers quietly, and found the transposition error in 4 minutes, and slid the book back to her without comment. And the fact that he had simply done the useful thing without performing any kind of generosity about it made her feel something so warm it frightened her slightly. There was the Sunday in August when she rode out alone to the far corner of the north pasture, which was where she went when she needed to be somewhere that had nothing to do with decisions or management or the daily machinery of running a life. And she sat on the hillock near the old cottonwood tree and just looked at the prairie, which was very beautiful in August, a particular shade of gold that the light made amber in the late afternoon. She had not told anyone where she was going, which meant it was entirely coincidental that Phineas Wells came up the same track 20 minutes later with a canteen and his hat in his hand, because he had, he said, been checking the fence line on the north boundary. The fence line on the north boundary was in the opposite direction. She looked at him. He met her gaze with the same calm he brought to everything, and did not offer any amendment to his explanation. "There's room on this hill if you're not actually going to the fence line," she said. He sat down about 4 feet away from her, and they looked at the prairie together for a long time without speaking, and it was the most comfortable silence Marcella had been in for years, and that fact alone told her something she had been working very hard not to know. "Do you miss it?" she asked eventually. "Texas." "Parts of it," he said. "The land is different down there, bigger somehow. But this," he made a small gesture that took in the grassland and the long horizon and the quality of the light. "This isn't hard to be in." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." A pause. "Did you grow up on a ranch?" he asked. "My father kept horses in Missouri," she said. "He used to let me work the animals with him from the time I was very small. My mother thought it was inappropriate for a girl. My father thought my mother was wrong about that particular thing and most others." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, low and genuine, and she was so surprised by it that she turned to look at him, because she had not heard him laugh before, not really, and the way it changed his face was something she wanted to see clearly so she could examine it later in the privacy of her own thoughts. He caught her looking. His expression shifted into something quieter, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the prairie was very large around them and the afternoon was very golden, and Marcella Alden, who had been holding herself carefully at arm's length from this feeling for 4 months, felt the distance close. She looked back at the horizon before anything could be said about it. "I should get back," she said. "Supper won't make itself." "I'll walk the fence line," he said, with a gravity that acknowledged the fiction of it. The North won. She rode back to the homestead and went straight to the kitchen and was very busy with absolutely nothing for the better part of an hour. It was Burl Hatch who said something first, because Burl Hatch had been watching the world from the corner of a room his entire life and had opinions about what he saw. He said it to Marcella one morning in September while they were looking at a new calf that had come in the night. He said it sideways, the way Burl said everything, which was to begin with something adjacent to the point and let the point reveal itself. "Wells is a good man," Burl said, with his eyes on the calf. "He is," Marcella agreed carefully. "Steady," Burl said. "Yes, not many like that." Marcella looked at Burl. Burl looked at the calf with the expression of a man who had said his piece and was done with it. "Burl," she said. "Ma'am, mind your business." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and continued looking at the calf with the distinct air of someone who had fully accomplished what they set out to do. The situation with Delbert Crane came to a head in September, because situations with men like Delbert Crane always came to a head when they were not handled definitively enough the first time. He came back to the ranch, this time with a man from the county assessor's office, and he had done something complicated with a debt that Robert Alden had taken out 3 years before purchasing seed grain. And the upshot of it, explained in terms designed to confuse rather than illuminate, was that there was some question about whether the debt had been properly discharged and whether it carried implications for the title of the ranch. Marcella listened to all of this with her hands folded in front of her on the porch rail and her face absolutely neutral, and when he had finished, she said she would need to consult with her attorney in Wichita. After they left, she sat at the kitchen table with the relevant papers Robert had kept in the tin box in the bedroom, and she went through them one by one, and what she found was that the debt had been paid. There was a receipt, but the receipt had not been properly filed with the county, which was a bureaucratic mistake and not a financial one, but it was the kind of mistake that men like Delbert Crane could use as a lever. She was reading through the papers for the 3rd time when Phineas came in for the evening, saw her expression, and sat down at the other end of the table without being asked. She told him. She told him plainly, in the same way she told him everything that pertained to the ranch, without performance or concealment, because that was how she had run things and how she intended to keep running them. He listened to all of it with his elbows on the table and his hands loosely clasped, and when she had finished, he said, "There's a land attorney in Wichita, name of Samuel Fortis, who is known for being honest and thorough. I've heard of men in similar situations using him well. He would need the receipt and the original loan document. Can he be trusted?" "I believe so. I can ask around further if you want confirmation." "Do that," she said, "and then I'll go to Wichita." "I'll come with you," he said. She looked at him. He met her look with the calm that she had come to understand was not the absence of feeling but the presence of steadiness. "It's a 2-day ride," she said, "or longer by wagon." "I know it," he said. "I can handle myself in Wichita, and I know the streets better than you might expect. And 2 sets of eyes are more useful than one when dealing with men like Crane." She thought about it for exactly as long as it took to decide she had already decided, which was not long. "All right," she said. "We'll leave Thursday." They rode to Wichita over 2 days, taking the wagon because Marcella had some supplies to bring back, and also because the wagon allowed them to talk more easily than riding side by side on horseback over rutted trail. She had packed food for the journey, and they ate at noon on the first day in the shade of a creek-bottom stand of cottonwoods, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with the ranch or Delbert Crane, because the journey had a different quality than the homestead, a looseness that permitted different conversations. She asked him about his family. He told her about his father, who had been a hard man but fair, and his mother, who had been both warm and pragmatic in equal measure, and 3 younger sisters who had all married and settled, 2 in Texas, and 1 gone east to St. Louis. He had not seen them in 2 years, which he said without particular regret, but with the specific quality of a man who has made peace with a loneliness he does not entirely choose. She told him about her parents, her father who had let her work horses and her mother who had been more right than Marcella, had given her credit for on several things, and not right at all on others. She told him about coming west with Robert, who had had a romanticism about ranching that had met the reality of it somewhat harder than expected. She spoke of Robert with the uncomplicated affection of genuine grief that has begun to find its shape, neither raw nor entirely healed, and Phineas listened to all of it without offering condolence or commentary, which she found, as she always found with him, to be exactly the right response. "He sounds like he was a man who tried," Phineas said when she had finished. "He was," she said. "He tried very hard. The land was harder. The land usually is." "Do you love it?" she asked. "The land, the work, truly." He considered this. "I love what's real about it," he said. "There are men who love it for the story of it, the idea of the West, and they tend not to last, because the story and the thing itself are different. I love the thing itself. The animals and the grass and the way the light sits on the plains in the evening, that's real, that I love." She looked at him in the filtered light of the cottonwood shade, and she felt, with a clean and unambiguous certainty, that she was in very serious trouble, and that she did not particularly mind. They spent the night at a roadside inn outside of Wellington, which was a respectable establishment with separate rooms for travelers, and in the morning they continued to Wichita. Samuel Fordyce turned out to be a small, precise man in his 50s, with a filing system that was the most organized thing Marcella had ever encountered, which immediately made her trust him. He examined the receipt and the loan document with the focused attention of a man who genuinely cared about getting things right, and he said that the situation was straightforward from a legal standpoint, and that Delbert Crane's position was far weaker than he had represented, because the receipt predated any claim he might make on the title, and the debt was demonstrably discharged. He said he could file the necessary paperwork with the county and provide Marcella with documentation that would settle the matter definitively, and that his fee for doing so was $12. Marcella shook his hand, paid his retainer, and they agreed he would send the completed documents to the Caldwell post office within 3 weeks. She walked out onto the street with Phineas beside her, and the late September sky was enormous and blue over Wichita, and she felt, for the first time in a year, that the ground beneath her was entirely solid. "Thank you," she said, "for knowing his name." "Samuel Fordyce," he said. "He was recommended to me by an honest man, so." "So," she agreed. She looked up the street, which was busy with wagons and horses and the commerce of a city that had grown quickly from nothing, and she thought, not for the first time, how strange the West was, how raw and recent, how everything here was still in the process of becoming what it was going to be. They had the afternoon before they would need to head back, and Phineas asked if she had any business in town, and when she said she did not, he asked if she minded walking. She did not mind walking. They walked through Wichita in the way of two people who have been thinking things they have not yet said, and at some point they passed a bakery that had a bench outside of it, and Phineas stopped and looked at it and then looked at her and said, "Do you want something sweet?" It was such a small and ordinary thing. She did not know exactly why it moved her. Perhaps because it was offered as simply as breathing, without any of the calculated generosity of a man trying to impress, just the straightforward human impulse to share something pleasant. "Yes," she said. They sat on the bench outside the bakery and ate apple pastries that were too sweet and very good, and the street moved past them with its horses and its commerce and its noise, and they sat close enough that their elbows nearly touched and neither of them moved away. He looked at her sideways, and she felt him looking, and she said, without turning her head, "What?" "Nothing," he said, and she could hear something in his voice that had not been there before, or had been there all along and she had only just learned how to hear it. She turned and looked at him. He looked back at her. The street went on being noisy and ordinary around them, and the afternoon sun was warm on the bench, and the moment was entirely clear. "Phineas," she said. "Marcella," he said, and the use of her given name the first time sat between them like a thing placed carefully on a table. She held his gaze. "This is complicated," she said. "I know it," he said. "I run the ranch, you work on it. I know that too. And I am still," she paused. "I am not finished grieving. I am not certain I will ever be entirely finished. He was my husband and I loved him." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be finished. I'm not asking anything." "Then what are you doing?" He thought about this. "I'm sitting on a bench in Wichita," he said, "eating a pastry with you, and I'd like to keep doing it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the street. Then she took another bite of her pastry, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was the shape of one. "All right," she said. "We can keep doing this." The drive back to Caldwell the following day had a different quality. Not dramatically different, not anything that would have been visible to an observer, but the air between them had shifted, the way air shifts before a storm, not ominous but charged. They talked more easily. She laughed twice at things he said, and both times it surprised her, not the laughter itself but how natural it felt. When they arrived back at the ranch in the late afternoon, Tommy Reese was waiting by the barn with the expression of a young man who had been watching for them and was pretending he had not been. He looked from Marcella to Phineas and back again with the transparency of 22 years and said, "How'd it go in Wichita?" And Marcella told him it had gone well, and Tommy nodded and went back to the barn with the look of someone storing information for later evaluation. October moved into the ranch with its cooling evenings and its particular golden light, and Marcella Alden and Phineas Wells moved through their days with the careful, deliberate approach of two people who had acknowledged something and were not rushing it. He continued to call her Mrs. Alden in front of the hands, and she continued to address him as Wells in the manner of employer to foreman, and these formalities were not a concealment but a consideration, a mutual agreement that whatever was happening between them deserved to be handled with care. In the evenings after supper, when Tommy and Burl had gone to the bunkhouse, and the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet, she sometimes sat on the porch and he sometimes joined her, and they talked. They talked about everything, about the cattle markets and the politics of the territory and whether Kansas would remain dry, about what they had read, about music, and whether there was likely to be a decent winter. He had a mind that worked the same way hers did, methodically and without pretension, and the pleasure of matching thoughts with someone who neither deferred to her nor talked over her was something she had not known she missed until she found it. It was on one of these evenings in the middle of October that he said, "I need to tell you something about why I left the Hutchinson Ranch." She set down her coffee cup and gave him her full attention. He had been with the Hutchinsons for 2 years, he said. In the second year, he had become aware that 2 of the hands were systematically underreporting cattle numbers, skimming the difference when they sold. He had reported this to old Warren Hutchinson, who had thanked him and taken a week to decide what to do about it. And in that week, the 2 hands had gotten wind of what was coming and had preemptively told Warren Hutchinson that Phineas Wells was the one who was light on numbers, and had produced a falsified record to support it. Warren Hutchinson was an old man by then, and not sharp, and he had believed what was easier to believe, which was often the way with old men who didn't want trouble. Phineas had been let go without a formal accusation, but with enough doubt attached to his name that finding work in Barber County had become difficult. "I want you to know that," he said. "Before this goes further, I want you to know the story that's out there about me, and I want you to know the truth of it, and then I want you to judge it as you see fit." Marcella looked at him in the darkness of the porch, at his hands loose around his coffee cup, and his face grave and open in the way it went when he was being entirely sincere. "Is there anyone who can confirm the truth of what you're telling me?" she said. "There's a man named Ruddy Esparza who worked at the Hutchinsons during the same period." He saw more than he said at the time because he had his own job to think of, but he'd speak to it now if asked directly. "He's in Barber County still, near Medicine Lodge." Looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "I'll write to Ruddy Esparza." He blinked, just slightly. "All right," he said. "And while I'm waiting for the response," she continued, "I'll tell you what I already know. You have been on this ranch for 6 months. I have watched you work every day, and I have not caught you in a dishonesty yet, which is itself a kind of testimony, but I'll write to Esparza." "That's fair," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She wrote to Ruddy Esparza the next morning. The response came back in 3 weeks, in time for November, and it said exactly what Phineas had said it would say. Ruddy Esparza wrote in the halting but sincere hand of a man who had been thinking about this for a while and was glad to finally put it down. He confirmed that Phineas Wells had been honest, that the other 2 hands had been dishonest, and that he was sorry he hadn't spoken sooner. Marcella read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in the tin box where she kept things that mattered. That evening she told Phineas what the letter said. He nodded and looked at the porch railing. She could see in his profile that it mattered more than he was letting on, and she let him have a moment with it before she said, "I never doubted you, but now I have it in writing, which is better for the ledger." He looked at her then with something in his eyes that was very warm and very careful all at once and said, "Thank you, Marcella." "Marcella," she said, "you've been using my name more. You haven't corrected me." "No," she said, "I haven't." The November air moved between them on the porch, carrying the smell of dry grass and approaching cold, and she was close enough to him that she could see the line of his jaw and the way his hands rested on the porch rail, and she thought, clearly and with full intention, that she was going to do something about this before winter closed everything in. She did not have to. He said quietly, "I have been trying to find the right moment to ask you something." "Ask it," she said. "When you're ready," he said, "and not before, and not because of anything except that it's what you want. I would like to court you properly, with your permission." Marcella Alden, who had managed a ranch alone and walked into a cattle pen to prove a point and traveled to Wichita to outmaneuver a land speculator, sat with this for a moment. And then she said, "You have it." The winter of 1878 to 1879 in Caldwell, Kansas was cold but not brutal. The kind of winter that settles in without catastrophe and requires simply the daily work of keeping things going. The ranch hunkered down into its winter routine, which was less frantic than summer but no less demanding, and Marcella and Phineas found their courtship taking the shape of their lives, which was to say it was practical and also very genuine. He brought her coffee in the morning when he came in from the early feeding, because he had noticed that she moved better after the first cup, and the first cup was always too hot to drink quickly. She saved him the problem pages of the account book, not because she couldn't solve them, but because she had noticed that he found satisfaction in it, and there was no reason to keep that from him. They read from the same books in the evenings and argued about what they read with the freedom of people who respect each other's minds and don't need to win. Tommy Reese, who had been processing the situation at his own pace, arrived at a conclusion about it one December morning when he caught Phineas Wells watching Marcella cross the yard with the expression of a man who has completely forgotten what he was doing. And Tommy said, with the blunt precision of the young, "You're gone on her, aren't you?" Phineas looked at Tommy for a moment. "That's not your business, Reese." "No, sir," Tommy agreed. "But it's good, though. She deserves it." Phineas looked at him for another second, and then something shifted in his expression and he said, "Yes, she does." Tommy nodded, satisfied, and went back to his work. Christmas came and Caldwell celebrated it in the manner of a frontier town, with church services and a gathering at the town hall that managed to be both modest and warm. Marcella went with Phineas and they stood among their neighbors in the hall and drank the sweet cider someone had brought. And people who had known Marcella through the year of her widowhood looked at them together and drew conclusions that were, for once, the right conclusions. A woman named Frances Kimball, who had been a friend of Marcella's since the early days of her marriage and who had an unabashed interest in everyone else's happiness, found Marcella in the kitchen of the town hall and looked at her with bright eyes and said, "You look well." "I am well," Marcella said. "Better than well," Frances said with careful emphasis. Marcella met her eyes and did not pretend. "Yes," she said, "better than well." Frances took her hand and pressed it. "Robert would have been glad," she said. "He always worried about you, about what would become of you alone." Marcella felt the familiar weight settle briefly on her chest, the grief that never entirely went away but had learned to make room for other things. "I know," she said. "He was kind like that." "Yes," Frances said. "He was, and so is this one." Marcella looked across the room to where Phineas stood with Burl Hatch and a couple of other ranchers, talking cattle in the way men did at any gathering regardless of the occasion, and he happened to look up at the same moment, and across the noise and the movement of the room he found her face with the unerring accuracy of a compass finding north. She held his gaze. He lifted his cup very slightly, just a small acknowledgement, just the two of them across the room, and then he went back to the conversation. Frances Kimball watched this exchange with the expression of a woman taking deep personal satisfaction in events she had no hand in whatsoever. "My goodness," she said softly. "Frances," Marcella said. "I'm not saying a word," Frances said. January was hard work and long evenings, and February brought the kind of cold that closed everything in and made the world feel very small and very intimate. The Alden ranch moved through it steadily. The cattle fed and the water troughs broken of ice each morning, and the accounts kept and the horses tended. And in the evenings the bunkhouse lamp burned at one end of the yard and the house lamp burned at the other, and the prairie stretched out enormous and dark and quiet all around them. On a February evening when the temperature had dropped hard and the wind was pressing against the walls of the house with real intention, Phineas came in from his last check of the barn and stood in the kitchen doorway brushing snow off his hat. And Marcella was at the stove, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of the stew she had put on at noon. And she turned to look at him in the doorway with the lamp light on his face, and the cold coming off him and his dark eyes warm, and she thought, "This is what a life looks like when it is working the way it is supposed to." "Cold," she said. "Considerably," he said, and hung his hat and coat and came to the stove. She handed him a cup. Their fingers touched in the passing, the ordinary accidental contact that happens dozens of times in daily life and usually means nothing, but between them at that particular moment, in that particular kitchen, it meant something, and she did not pretend it didn't, and he did not pretend it didn't, and they stood close together at the stove while the wind pressed against the walls and the stew made its quiet sounds in the pot. "Marcella," he said. "Yes, I'd like to marry you." She had known it was coming, in the way you know a season is coming when you have been watching the signs of it for months. And still the hearing of it was something different than the anticipating of it, and she put both hands around her cup and stood with it for a moment. "You know it's complicated," she said, which was not a no. "I know it," he said. "The ranch is yours. It will stay yours. My employment here doesn't obligate you to anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm asking because I want to build a life alongside you, not because I expect anything in exchange." She looked at him. "Do you understand that the ranch comes first? That there will be mornings when the cattle need something before I need something?" "I've been here 8 months," he said quietly. "I think I understand that. And do you understand that I will make my own decisions? That I will ask for your counsel when I want it, and that wanting it doesn't mean I'm obligated to take it?" "I wouldn't want it any other way," he said. "I mean that. I've known enough men who needed to be the final word on everything to know I'm not one of them." She believed him. She believed him because she had watched him for 8 months and the evidence was overwhelming. And she believed him because she had learned in her 31 years to trust the testimony of her own observation over the optimism of her own hopes, and in this case they were saying the same thing. "Then yes," she said, "I'll marry you." The wind pressed against the house, and the stove burned warm, and Phineas Wells set down his cup and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that she had not expected from those particular hands, large and work-hardened as they were, and he kissed her in the lamp light of the kitchen with the full weight of everything he had not been saying for 8 months behind it, and she kissed him back with the full weight of everything she had not been saying either, and the winter could do what it liked outside. They married in March of 1879 in the Caldwell church, on a day when the first real warmth of approaching spring had arrived, and the sky was clear and enormous. Frances Kimball cried, which she had predicted she would. Tommy Reese stood very straight in his good shirt and looked moved in the way that young men look moved when they are determined not to show it. Burl Hatch said not a single word all morning, but shook Phineas's hand afterward with both of his and held it for a moment, which was more than most people got from Burl. Marcella wore a dress she had made herself from blue cotton, because she was not 20 years old and had not been trying to be a bride. She was trying to be married, and the distinction mattered to her. She carried a small bunch of dried prairie flowers because there were no fresh ones yet. She said her vows in a clear, unwavering voice and met Phineas's eyes throughout, and he said his in the same voice he used for everything, steady and certain. And when the minister said they were married, the relief and the joy arrived together in Marcella's chest in a way that surprised her with its fullness. The matter of Delbert Crane had been resolved in January, when Samuel Fordyce's paperwork had come through and established the title definitively, and Crane had retreated to Wichita to find someone else to press. Marcella had received the documents with satisfaction and filed them in the tin box, and felt the last of that particular weight lift from her shoulders. The ranch was hers, clear and uncontested, and now it was theirs together, which was different only in the way that a good thing shared becomes a better thing. The spring of 1879 was busy in the way of all springs on the plains, and Marcella and Phineas worked it together as they had the previous year, with the difference that there was no longer a gap between them that required navigating. They worked with the easy coordination of people who have already said the important things and can now put their full attention on the work itself. Tommy Reese, who had been quietly improving all year under the influence of watching competent people do things correctly, stepped into responsibilities that freed Phineas and Marcella to work at a broader level of management, and Burl Hatch, predictably, continued to do exactly what Burl Hatch had always done, which was everything necessary and nothing unnecessary. They expanded the herd that summer with the purchase of 12 additional head, which Marcella had been saving toward since the previous autumn. The cattle market was favorable, and the Alden Ranch, which had been a modest operation when Robert died, was becoming a solid one under the combined effort of its occupants. Marcella kept the books with her characteristic precision, and Phineas handled the operational details with his characteristic thoroughness, and they argued productively about decisions and agreed on most things and disagreed about a few, and resolve the disagreements without damage. In June of 1879, Marcella told Phineas she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen in the morning in the matter-of-fact way she told him things, and his response was not what she had expected, which was a composed pleasure. Instead, he was entirely still for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her, not dramatically, just with his arms around her and his face against her hair, and he stood there for a long time and didn't say anything at all, and she could feel in the quality of his silence all the things he did not yet have words for, and she held on to him and let the morning run on around them outside. "Are you well?" he said eventually into her hair. "I'm very well," she said. "Good," he said. "Good." He pulled back and looked at her face, and she saw in his expression the particular combination of joy and gravity that comes to people who understand that good things carry weight as well as lightness, and she loved him for it, the way she loved everything about him that was real. "We'll need to add on to the house," she said. "There isn't a second room that would do." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about the east wall." "Of course you have," she said. He smiled then, fully, which was still something she did not take for granted even after a year of knowing him, because he did not distribute his smiles casually, and so the genuine ones landed with their full value. "We're going to be fine," he said. "I know that," she said. "I've known that since the cattle pen." He looked at her. "The cattle pen." "I walked in there to prove a point," she said, "and you came in and stood where I could reach you if I needed to. That told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man you were." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't want to interfere," he said. "You didn't need interfering with. But the bull on the south side was getting restless, and I thought—" "I know what you thought," she said. "You thought you'd put yourself where you were useful without making it about yourself. That's a specific kind of character. Or just common sense," he said. "In my experience," she said, "common sense and good character are harder to find separately than they should be. Finding them together is rarer still." He looked at her with the warmth in his eyes that she had come to think of as specifically hers, the way certain things between people become theirs alone, private as a signature. He said, "I was half in love with you before you'd said a single word to me." "Half," she repeated. "The other half took, until you walked out of that pen looking like you'd simply done what needed doing, and had no interest in anyone's opinion about it." She laughed, and it was the full laugh, not the one she kept for company, but the one she kept for people she trusted entirely, and he watched her laugh with the expression of a man who has arranged his life around something worth arranging it around. The addition to the east wall of the house was completed by September, a proper room that would serve well enough for the purposes immediately intended and for any future purposes that came after. Phineas did most of the framing himself with Tommy's help, and Marcella directed the placement of the window because she was particular about light, and the whole enterprise was accompanied by the commentary of Burl Hatch, who had opinions about construction that he did not usually bother to voice, but voiced freely throughout this project. Their son was born in January of 1880, in the middle of a mild spell that had settled over the Kansas plains as if in consideration. Marcella had a good labor and a skilled midwife in Mrs. Garvey from Caldwell, and Phineas spent the preceding hours in the kitchen putting himself through the torture of waiting, with the particular focused desperation of a competent man facing something he cannot do anything useful about. When Mrs. Garvey opened the bedroom door and said, "Mr. Wells, you have a son," he crossed the room with a speed that Mrs. Garvey would describe later to Francis Kimball as rather undignified in the best possible way. The boy was solid and loud and red-faced with the effort of arriving, and when Marcella held him against her and looked at Phineas sitting on the edge of the bed with his large hands hovering in the uncertain way of new fathers who are afraid of their own strength, she said, "He's all right. You can hold him." Phineas took the baby with the same deliberate care he brought to every physical task that mattered, and the boy blinked at him with the unfocused gravity of the newly born, and Phineas looked at him for a long time without speaking. "Henry," Marcella said, "if you like it." "Henry," he repeated, and the word came out softened by something she recognized as the kind of feeling that doesn't have a name. "Henry Robert Wells," she said, "after your father and mine." He looked at her over the baby's head. She saw in his face the way everything had come together in that moment, the loss and the love and the forward momentum of a life that had decided to keep going, and she felt it herself, clear and complete. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, which was rough with a day's growth of beard and warm, and he turned his face just slightly into her palm. "Thank you," he said. "Thank yourself," she said. "You helped considerably." He made the low, genuine sound that was his laugh, muffled by the gravity of the moment, and Henry Robert Wells blinked at the ceiling and seemed, in his brand new way, unimpressed by the enormity of everything around him. The spring of 1880 brought the ranch into a new phase, because Marcella, who had been running things with the resources of a grief-diminished operation for too long, now had the full partnership of a man who was her equal in every way that mattered, and the combination produced results. They extended their pasture rights through an arrangement with the neighboring Fowler property, whose owner had moved east and was willing to lease the grazing for a fair price. They drove 18 head to the Caldwell stockyards in April and got prices that made Gerald Hooper, who happened to be the buyer again, look at the Alden cattle with considerably more respect than he had shown in the spring of 1878. Marcella stood at the outer fence for this negotiation, because Henry was 6 months old and it was cold, and Tommy was inside the pen with the cattle anyway, and she did not need to walk into it to prove anything this time. She had already proven it. She had proven it to herself, which was the only audience that had ever mattered. Phineas stood beside her at the fence and said nothing during the negotiation because she was the one who knew the numbers and she was the one who did the talking. And when Hooper agreed to her price and she shook his hand, Phineas caught her eye over the man's retreating back, and the exchange between them said everything that didn't need to be said out loud. The summer of 1880 brought a stretch of weather that tested every rancher in Sumner County, a hot, dry period that yellowed the grass earlier than it should and made the creek run low and required constant management of water sources. Marcella and Phineas and their hands worked through it with the stubborn patience of people who understand that the land has its own calendar and cannot be argued with, only adapted to. Tommy Reese, who had been proving himself steadily across 2 years of observation, proposed to a girl in Caldwell named Clara Swanson, and was accepted, which event he reported to Marcella with the earnest pride of someone expecting congratulation, and received it in full. Burl Hatch responded to this news by patting Tommy on the shoulder once, firmly, which was his version of a toast. The drought broke in August and the grass came back and the cattle found their weight again, and the creek refilled itself with rain that came down straight and solid and smelled of everything the land needed. Marcella stood on the porch in the rain and let it soak her without moving, because some things were worth standing in the middle of, and Phineas came out and stood beside her without asking why she was standing in the rain, because by now he understood her well enough to know that some things didn't require explanation. "It's going to be a good year," she said. "It is," he agreed. Henry, who was 8 months old and being held by Francis Kimball inside the house while his parents stood incomprehensibly in the rain, could be heard expressing opinions about the situation in the emphatic language of infancy. "He wants you," Phineas said. "He wants me to come in out of the rain," she agreed, and went inside. By the autumn of 1880, the Alden Ranch, which had quietly continued to bear Marcella's name, because she had decided she wanted to keep it, and Phineas had said that was entirely right, was one of the more productive small operations in the county. They were not wealthy, not by the standards of the great ranch operations that were beginning to consolidate across the plains, but they were solvent and growing, and more importantly they were theirs in the full sense, built on genuine work and genuine knowledge, and the kind of partnership that comes from two people who chose each other clearly and deliberately, and kept choosing each other every day without drama about it. Delbert Crane had not returned. The documentation from Samuel Fortis was filed and irrefutable, and the title of the Alden Ranch sat in the Sumner County records with the kind of clarity that discouraged speculators. Marcella had heard, through the ordinary channels of small-town information, that Crane had relocated to Indian Territory to pursue whatever Crane pursued, and she thought about this briefly, and then thought about other things. On an October evening very like the one on the previous October, when the grass was golden and the sky was enormous, and the evening light sat on the plains in the particular way that Phineas had described loving, they sat on the porch after supper, Henry asleep in his cradle inside, the autumn air carrying the smell of approaching cold. "I want to tell you something," Marcella said. He turned from his looking at the horizon to look at her. "I was not sure I would ever want this again," she said. "A life, this kind of life with someone after Robert, I was not sure I had the space for it." "I know," he said. "I want you to know that I am sure now," she said, "in case I haven't been clear enough about it, in case the daily running of things has made it seem ordinary. It isn't, you aren't." He looked at her with his dark eyes in the autumn dusk, and the warmth in them was the particular steady warmth of a fire that has been burning long enough to be entirely trustworthy. "Marcella," he said. "Don't be sentimental about it," she said. "I'm just being accurate." "You're always accurate," he said. "Yes," she said. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand and held it with the same care he held everything he valued, and she let him, and the prairie turned its colors in the last light of the October evening, and the night came in slowly, as nights do, and the lamp was burning in the window behind them, and Henry made a small sound in his sleep and was quiet again. "I think we should get a dog," Phineas said. She looked at him. "Where did that come from?" "Henry is going to need something to grow up alongside. A boy and a dog are a good combination. Henry is 10 months old. So get the dog now, and by the time Henry knows what it is, they'll be established." She considered this. "What kind of dog?" "Something sturdy," he said. "Smart. Like a cattle dog. That would be useful." "You want a working dog," she said. "I want a dog that pulls its weight," he agreed, with the gravity of a man making a serious point. "Everything in this household pulls its weight," she said. "That's a principle I can support," he said. She kept hold of his hand and looked at the evening sky, which had gone to a deep violet at the horizon and a soft black overhead, and the first stars were appearing, and she thought about what the next year would look like, and the year after, and the shape of a life that had turned a corner and was now heading somewhere good. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "Henry is going to have company," she said. "In the summer, I expect." The stillness happened again, the same complete stillness she had seen in February of the previous year when she had told him the first time, and then he turned to her, and his face in the starlight was the face of a man who has been given more than he expected from life and knows it. "Are you well?" he said, exactly as he had said it the first time. "I'm very well," she said, exactly as she had said it then. He brought her hand up and pressed it against his chest, over his heart, and she could feel it beating under her palm, steady and strong. "We're going to need a bigger addition," he said. "I've been thinking about the north wall," she said. He laughed fully, with the richness of a man who is genuinely happy, and she laughed with him there on the porch in the October dark. And inside the house Henry slept on undisturbed, and the Alden ranch lay around them in the starlight, solid and real and theirs. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was harder than the previous one, with a stretch of cold in February that put ice on the creek thicker than Marcella's fist and kept the cattle in the barn for 2 weeks straight. It required the kind of sustained effort that leaves no room for anything else during the days, and the nights were long and cold and very quiet, and they sat together in the house after Henry was asleep and talked and read and sometimes played cards, badly, because neither of them had much talent for it, and the ordinary domesticity of it was something that Marcella sometimes caught herself simply watching, as if from a slight distance, with the particular gratitude of someone who knows the value of a thing, because they have also known its absence. Her second pregnancy moved through winter and into spring without difficulty, and the north wall addition was completed by April, a comfortable room with the window positioned as she specified, south-facing for the afternoon light. The baby arrived in June of 1881, a girl this time, louder and more definitive about her opinions from the first breath than Henry had been. Mrs. Garvey said she had a will to her that you could feel from across the room. Phineas held her in the same careful way he had held Henry, with the same deliberate reverence, and she looked up at him with newborn eyes and closed her fist around his smallest finger and held on with a strength that was disproportionate and entirely characteristic. "Clara," Marcella said, "for Tommy's wife, if you agree." "Clara," he said, and the name sat warmly in the room. "Clara Wells." "Clara Alden Wells," Marcella said, with a look that dared him to argue. He did not argue. He smiled the full smile and looked down at Clara Alden Wells, holding his finger, and said, "All right, Clara Alden Wells it is." Tommy Reese, when informed that the baby bore his wife's name, turned red to the ears and cleared his throat several times and then said, "That's mighty kind," in a voice that needed some work. His wife Clara cried with open happiness and brought a pie to the ranch that same afternoon, which was received with the gratitude it deserved. Burl Hatch looked at the baby when Marcella brought her out onto the porch on a fine July day, looked at her for a solid minute with the serious attention he gave to all important assessments, and said, "She's a good one." He then went back to the fence he had been mending. The summer of 1881 was a good one, as good summers go in that country, which is to say it was hot and demanding and occasionally alarming and entirely worth being in. The ranch prospered in the steady, undramatic way of things built on sound principles. Henry learned to walk in September, which he did with the single-minded determination of a person who has decided that crawling is beneath him and will tolerate no delay in the acquisition of upright locomotion. He walked into things at speed and got up and walked into other things, and Phineas watched this process with an expression that Marcella identified as pride mixed with recognition. "He gets that from you," she told him. The walking into things. The getting up. The dog appeared in October, a blue heeler that Phineas brought back from Wichita in the bed of the wagon alongside a load of winter supplies. A sturdy, sharp-eyed animal of perhaps 8 months who had been working cattle since she was old enough to stand and had more intelligence in her pointed face than most people Marcella had dealt with across a negotiating table. Henry, who was 19 months old and had recently concluded that the world was full of wonders requiring thorough investigation, encountered the dog in the yard, and the two of them looked at each other for a long moment, and arrived at some mutual understanding that adults were not privy to, and from that point forward they were inseparable. The dog, whom Henry called Spot with the creative abandon of toddlerhood despite having no spots whatsoever, slept at the foot of his bed and worked the cattle with the precision of a professional, and came to Marcella's whistle as readily as to anyone else's. "She's a good one," Burl said about the dog, using exactly the same words he had used about Clara, which Marcella found satisfying in a way she couldn't entirely articulate. By the autumn of 1881, 3 years after a widow had walked into a cattle pen in Caldwell, Kansas, to prove a point to a buyer who had underestimated her, the Alden Ranch was a different thing than it had been. It was larger, more solid, better managed. It had 2 additions to the house, and a new section of barn, and a working dog, and 2 children, and a foreman who had become a husband and a partner in the full sense of both words. Marcella Alden Wells, who kept both names because they told the full story, sat at her kitchen table one November morning with her account book and her coffee, and the particular quiet of a house in which 2 children are inexplicably, blessedly asleep at the same time, and she looked at the numbers, which were good, and then she looked out the window at the yard, where Phineas was working with Tommy on the fence line along the east pasture, their breath making small clouds in the cold morning air. Their movements easy and coordinated with the familiarity of men who who have worked alongside each other long enough to develop a shared language of motion. She watched him without his knowing she was watching, the way she sometimes did, not from any impulse toward surveillance but from the particular pleasure of seeing a person you love when they don't know they're being seen, when they're just themselves without the slight alteration that presence creates. He was checking the fence posts with the methodical attention he gave everything, pressing each one and noting the give of it, and there was something in the simple competence of the action, the large, careful hands and the focused expression, and the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his life, that made her feel something she had stopped trying to name precisely because it was too large for any specific word. She had thought, after Robert died, that her life had a shape, and she knew what that shape was. She had thought that what remained was to manage it with dignity and make the best of what she had. She had not anticipated that the shape would change, that grief had not been a wall but a winter, and that spring had been coming all along without her permission. She had walked into that cattle pen to prove something to Gerald Hooper, who was not worth proving anything to. What she had not known, walking in, was that someone would come in behind her and stand where she could reach him, and that this quiet, uncommented act would tell her more about the character of a man than years of conversation might have done. She turned back to her account book and finished the column she had been working on, and the numbers added up to exactly what they should. And outside, Phineas and Tommy moved along the fence line with their breath rising in the cold air, and Henry made a sound from the back room that suggested his sleep was about to end with the energy that generally characterized his approach to being awake, and Clara was still quiet, and the coffee was warm, and the morning was entirely ordinary and entirely good. She heard the back door open and Phineas came in for water, as he often did mid-morning, and she looked up from the account book and he looked at her and she looked at him and there was nothing needing to be said, which was one of the best things that could be said about anyone. "Good numbers?" he asked. "Very good," she said. He filled his cup and looked at her across the kitchen with those dark eyes that she had first seen inside a cattle pen on a spring morning in 1878, steady and warm and entirely present, and she thought, here is a man who stood where I could reach him and has been standing there ever since. He went back out to the fence line. She went back to her numbers. Henry woke up and called for her and she went to him, and the morning continued, ordinary and irreplaceable, on the Alden Ranch in Caldwell, Kansas, where two people had found each other in the particular way that people sometimes find each other in the middle of work that matters, by accident and by attention, and by the slow accumulation of all the things that are said without words, and had made from it something solid and lasting and good. Clara began to make small sounds from her room, the preliminary sounds of a baby waking up to a world she had already decided she intended to manage thoroughly, and Henry ran into the kitchen on the sturdy legs that had so recently learned to carry him, and held up a small carved horse that Phineas had made for him on a quiet winter evening, insisting with the eloquence of 20 months that something required her attention. And Spot the dog appeared from somewhere and sat down by the stove and watched everything with her sharp healer eyes, and Marcella Alden Wells stood in her kitchen in the November light and held her son, and thought that grief and love were not opposites but companions, that the space Robert had held in her heart had not been replaced but added to, that the heart was larger than anyone told you it was, and that the prairie outside her window was going to be golden again in the spring, and she was going to be here to see it, and so was Phineas, and so were these children with their whole enormous lives ahead of them, and that was enough. That was everything.